I'm Natalia Lobach, and this is Change Course. The leading edge of change. So this week on the Change Course podcast, we're going to jump off where we left off last week, which was the brief history of change management. And in that episode, I mentioned that this week, I'd talk a little bit more about where the practice is going. And this is where I personally start to get really excited because this is the new stuff, the stuff that is constantly iterating, learning, changing, and, can really help us become even more effective change leaders in our work and in our lives. So for me, there are 3 areas where I see the practice really evolving and changing. And so the first area is how we look at organizations. The second is deepening our understanding of people. And the third is how work itself is changing. The first part, how we look at organizations. So, as I mentioned in the previous episode, the majority of the models for change that have been developed up to fairly recently have all focused on managing change in industrial systems. So industrial systems are process-driven. They are linear, hierarchical. You might think of M-form organizations. Typically, when you're working with change in rigid structured organizations, the types of models that we've talked about in the previous episode, they work. But what happens when you start getting into organizations that are more loosely connected? How do you get into working through change in systems-based organizations, matrixed organizations? Things are getting more and more complex, and organizational structures are reflecting that, especially since we are moving more into knowledge economies, service economies, and not so much into industrial economies. So a couple key pieces here is thinking about the organization as a system. So the foundational seminal work here is by Donella H. Meadows, Thinking in Systems. And this really gets into this whole idea around systems thinking as opposed to industrial or hierarchical type of thinking. So when we approach organizations in change, approaching them as systems, and we're going to get into this even deeper in a future episode. So complex adaptive systems are a whole other piece of this where you see action and reaction inside a system to different interventions. And so change all of a sudden starts to look a little bit different. Logical and structured interventions and initiatives sometimes have a big effect in complex adaptive systems. If you're lucky, other times they don't. And so thinking about the organization differently is definitely going to help in terms of how to make change effective. Another thinker in this area is Paul Gibbons, and I'm going to reference 2 works here that are recent. So Impact, 21st Century Change Management, Behavioral Science, Digital Transformation, and the Future of Work. Okay, it is a pre-pandemic book, but it does get into highly technology-driven change, more complex, and it does look at system theory as part of that. The other one that I want to mention is the science of organizational change. So again, this is by Paul Gibbons. It's been updated, and I'm sure there's going to be another update coming. But this is really about how leaders set strategy, change behavior, and create an agile culture. So that's our first link as well to how work is changing that I was going to talk about in the third category. So one of the most interesting things about this work and the thinking by Paul Gibbons is that he's introduced this integral change model. And so balancing individual and collective factors as well as internal and external forces. This is where, for me, that magic really starts to happen in looking at organizations differently. So highly encourage, if you want to take a deeper dive into some of these concepts, those 3 pieces I mentioned, I will link them in the show notes as well. The second topic where change is really starting to advance is how we're integrating better understanding of people. So it's not that change is driving additional research and additional thinking in the area of understanding human behavior a little bit better. It's that the domain of change management is now starting to embrace and consider the science and the research in this area more deeply. So when we talk about understanding people, we are talking about human behavior and how human behavior plays a really important role in change. And we're also talking about the power of the human mind. And so how the impact of mindset and how people interpret and view change as a really key component of driving a successful change strategy. So this is where I've been doing a lot of personal reading in the last 3 to 4 months. And I mean, there is just such a wealth of information here. I'm going to talk about a couple key pieces that I have actually been going back to a number of times. And there's just some really great thinking around this. So I mentioned in the last episode, nudge theory. So great book by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein called Nudge. I'm sure you've heard of it, but it's this idea that microfeedback can influence thinking, decisions, reactions. And it's a really interesting way to look at how you impact individual thinking as well as collective thinking in groups. Really interesting read. Highly recommend this one. And, there's this other piece around habit and behavior. So if you haven't read Atomic Habits by James Clear, this is a great time to do it. Everybody's read this one. Everyone is talking about it. It is a fantastic book. And there's a couple key pieces here that are really interesting. So this idea of the long tail. So different people have talked about this idea of when you're actually making change, it looks like an overnight thing. But what you don't see is the thousands of interventions, the hours of effort that you've put into something that then produces a result after time. And so I like to think of it, I'm, a scientist in my background, but for those of you who took chemistry in high school and your teacher would make you do that experiment where you had an indicator that would turn the solution pink when it reached a certain level of acidification. So it reached a certain pH and the solution would turn pink. Well, everyone started out with a solution that was clear, and you started dropping, with your test tube and your pipette, you're dropping a little bit of sulfuric acid in, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And then all of a sudden, boom, your solution turns pink. Well, it's the same idea. You don't see the cumulative effect of adding all of those drops of acid into that solution. And all you see is all of a sudden when the indicator says, oh, you've reached a certain level of acidity, we're going to turn pink now. But what you don't see is by adding and adding and adding to that system, you're slowly approaching that point at which the system turns. Again, Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell that I talked about in some of those previous episodes. Same thinking. The second thing that I really love about James Clear's Atomic Habits is the idea of identity, and identity as being a key part in change. So when we think about human stories and how we attach to different stories, our teams, our organizations have identities. One of the key things that we can do in order to bring about change in those environments is to tell a different story about identity. So that is like food for thought for another episode. I'd like to get deep into how you use story to prompt change, and specifically origin story linked to identity. But this is a great place to start for understanding how habit can be changed, how habit influences change, and then those components of identity and the long tail. Last piece here is, of course, if you haven't heard about it, Carol Dweck's mindset. So this idea of growth versus fixed mindset. So understanding that when you are trying to change in a fixed mindset environment, it's not going to work. So how to work through that change curve with individuals such they're in a place, such that they are in a place that they're able to approach it with a growth mindset. They see possibility, they're able to learn, they're able to grow, they're able to move through change. Last piece I want to mention is the latest book out by Adam Grant called Think Again. And this is all about how people change their minds. So really understanding how this human intervention piece works, how we change our minds, how we think differently, how we rethink things. These are really interesting tools and concepts that are starting to come into this body of work around change. The last piece I'm going to mention is, if you're looking to get deeper into this area, it's really, really helpful to understand human behavior models, so behavioral change models. Now, I did, because of the schooling that I had back at the University of Waterloo, thank you, Health Studies program, we talked a lot about behavioral change as it had to do with health behaviors. Now, this area is now expanding. So now we understand a lot more about human behavior and behavioral change when it involves not just health behaviors, but like a whole host of other things. So I'm going to link one book that will help you get a deeper understanding into the theory and the science that derives this area, but also helps you with the tactical designing of interventions, because it's all about designing interventions that help people use that behavioral model to get change as the result. So the book is The Behavioral Change Wheel, A Guide to Designing Interventions, and it's by Susan Mishi, Lou Atkins, and Robert West. So I'll link that one as well. I love that resource. It's really helpful for me, and I hope that you will find it helpful as well. The third area where change management is really evolving is agile. So Big A Agile is a methodology. It works in technology, and it started in technology. So Scrum, Agile, you're probably hearing those words. If you're not, I would be very surprised. But, Agile itself is a methodology that has deep roots and is applied today pretty much in every technology company and every technology system, and is a way to rapidly rethink development. So technology development of solutions. And what it does is it puts the customer in constant feedback and in constant contact with the development team. So you have this highly collaborative, highly innovative environment that produces successive innovations as opposed to, one final product or one final result at the end. Again, when you're looking at change in a system that's agile, it's a system. It is not a hierarchical organization. And in technology, we talked about this as waterfall-based change. That really is not, waterfall is really not where we're going anymore. Agile is really the way forward. And this idea that you're going to have rapid, successive change and that the environment that you're in is always changing. So this area rapidly expanding, and there's a lot of new research and new discussion coming out on it all the time. But I'd like to link two specific works that I have been leaning on a little bit more. And the first one is Doing Agile Right, Transformation Without Chaos. This really focuses on transformation of organizations. Again, so, it's a change domain, but transformation from the lens of Agile. So that's by Daryl Rigby, Sarah Elk, and Steve Perez. They're from Bain & Company, so, some old consulting cred there. And again, so really interesting how Agile is now starting to drive the way that we change. Now, I already mentioned The Science of Organizational Change by Paul Gibbons, but this is, again, where you can start to dig deeper into how do you incorporate Agile? And really the key is when you're looking at doing change in more of an Agile way, you're pulling your stakeholders in at the beginning and you are leaning on them throughout. You're also having and cultivating that constant feedback loop around how are things going? How can we do this better? How effective is this? What do we need to change? So really interesting in how stakeholders and the people that you're serving are becoming more of an integral part of that process, of that change management process. So there's, a ton to read here. I mean, certainly I've only talked about two specific resources that I like, but, there's a ton of reading there. And certainly every conference that I'm seeing these days, it includes at least one talk on agile change management, if not several. So this is another area where I really see the practice expanding and, some really interesting new ideas forming. As a bonus at the very end of this episode, I'm going to talk about 4 additional works that really do it all. So they do that whole foundational work around what is change, how can I understand more about it? And if you're looking to get into the practice and you want to do some self-led learning, these are great places to start. So as a bonus, these would be like if I was offering the course on change management at my local university, these would be, potentially required, maybe one of them required and a couple of them optional, but I'll leave that up to you. So the Effective Change Manager's Handbook, this is the essential guidance to the change management body of knowledge. So this book is really the textbook that goes along with the APMG International Change Management Certification. This has everything. So if you want to, do a quick dive and really shore up learning in this area, this is an amazing book. My personal copy of this has about 40 Post-it notes in it, and highlights throughout of stuff that I'm constantly going back to and referring to. The other 2 works that I lean on a lot are by Peter M. Senge, The Fifth Discipline and The Dance of Change. So these 2 books go together. But The Fifth Discipline is really around the learning organization, this idea of the learning organization. And so, again, speaking to these ideas of organizational systems, moving away from industrial models This is the stuff that's really getting into how do organizations at a system level learn and change. The last one is making sense of change management, and they call this one a complete guide to the models, tools, and techniques of organizational change. So Esther Cameron and Mike Green, again, this is a textbook type of work, but gives you a really holistic sense on, the models that are out there, how to use them, how to apply them. So if you're looking to, again, just have like that resource that you can go to in a very real sense, that's a great one as well. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard, I invite you to like, share, rate, and subscribe because it helps others find us. You can find our show notes on our website at www.charthouse.ca, where each episode has a page under the Change Course podcast. So anything that I've referenced in today's episode will be posted there so you can find it with easy to follow links and a full guide to everything that we talked about today. While you're visiting us, sign up for the Change Navigator newsletter. You'll get a monthly dispatch of all things change, what we're working on, and our latest research. Our music is Levity by Emily Clausen. Change Course is available wherever you listen to podcasts. We also have an accessible version on YouTube with fully edited captions, and you can find the link to our YouTube channel in the show notes. Thank you again for listening, and remember, it's never too late to change course.